and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to The Future is Female. This is the show where we find the extraordinary in every woman. I'm delighted to introduce my guest today, Dr. Susan Carland, a sociologist of religion and Deputy Director of Research, Impact and Engagement for the School of Social Sciences at Monash University in Melbourne. She's the author of Fighting Hislam, Women, Faith and Sexism. What a great title for a book. And she's also been listed as one of the 500 most influential Muslims in the world and has been named as a Muslim leader of tomorrow by the UN Alliance of Civilizations. It's such a wonderful joy to have you here with me. Thank you so much for joining me on the show. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
I was hoping maybe you can introduce yourself a little bit to our audience today. Tell us a bit about yourself and how did you get into this research area of the intersection between gender, Islamophobia and social cohesion?
Well, yeah, as you said, I'm an academic. I work at the Monash University in Australia. I became Muslim when I was a teenager, so a very long time ago. Let's not talk about how long ago. It was about 25 years ago, so a long time. I'm a wife and a mum, and in terms of how I became interested in this area, I think it's something about it's the lived reality that I have. You know, once I became Muslim, people were always wanting to talk to me about, well, what does it mean to be a Muslim woman? And aren't Muslim women oppressed? And all those standard stereotypes. So I felt I needed to get up to speed on being able to answer those questions very quickly and also have a reasonable insight into the reality. It's one thing to talk about the theory of how Islam should be practiced and what Islam teaches, but also what's actually going on in the community. And then also in terms of my research into Islamophobia and social cohesion, again, that's my lived reality. I'm an Australian citizen. I want to improve society just like anyone else. And also as a Muslim woman, you know, Islam is very much a minority in Australia, being conscious of the reality of Islamophobia. You know, I was Muslim before 9/11. We've lived through a lot of events in Australia and trying to work, as so many other Muslims were, about trying to improve relationships in Australia between Muslim and non-Muslim Australians. What does that look like? What does that mean? Where are we trying to go?
Okay, so that was where you started the research from. Where did the research take you?
Good question. Well, in terms of the research on Muslim women, I was really interested in particularly Muslim women who were fighting sexism that happened within the Muslim community. Sexism happens in every community, but who were specifically doing it from a faith-grounded and a faith-positive perspective. So these were women who were very passionate about Islam and really believed that any sexism that they experienced was a contravention of their rights in Islam. And so they worked really hard to combat things like domestic violence in the Muslim community, women's leadership, women's access to the mosque. And they talked about why they did that, the opposition that they faced, and also the support and what they were trying to achieve. So that was that research, which was amazing, and I was exposed to so many amazing Muslim women. And then with Islamophobia, looking at the work that Muslim women are doing to try to counter Islamophobia in Australia and build good social connections and social relationships with non-Muslims.
So they are trying to address sexism from within their communities.
Yes.
And they're trying to address Islamophobia from outside their communities.
Yeah.
So give me an example of a lived experience of one of the people that you spoke to for your research, for your book.
Well, in terms of one of the women that I spoke to about fighting sexism within the Muslim community, one example is of a woman who wanted to go and pray at her local mosque, but the women's section was locked. It was always chained shut from the inside and the outside, so they couldn't get in. And she tried contacting the mosque organisers to say, you've locked us out, please, we want to just come in and perform our prayers. They ignored her, and so she and some friends went to the mosque and said, we're just going to pray behind the men. So nothing really controversial or unorthodox. They said, we're just going to go into the men's section, we'll pray at the back. And the mosque committee was so angry at her for doing that, they kicked her out and they called the police.
Wow.
And they banned this for her. So this is a really interesting example, again, of what I was saying about women who are very much grounding their work in their faith. She's saying, this is my right to pray in the mosque. I'm not trying to do anything radical or revolutionary. I'm happy to pray at the back. but I want to claim my right. So that, and unfortunately that wasn't received very well by some of the people in her community. But it is also important to note that for all the women I spoke to, they all very much said there were a lot of Muslim women and men who were very supportive of the work they did. Because none of this, we can't collapse this, we can't flatten this. We have to see this as a nuanced issue, which is, like I said, unfortunately, sexism occurs in every community around the world. Sometimes, unfortunately, happens in the Muslim community as well. And Muslim women are using their religion as the tool to try to fight against the sexism that they experience.
Can I ask you, so that's so interesting that while sexism does happen, but there are others within the community who are loud championing voices against it. What did you learn about Islam, the faith, and the community throughout your research? I'm curious to know, because there's this idea, as you rightly pointed out in the beginning, that maybe from the outside there's a long associated view of Islam oppressing women, and sometimes that misogyny has also been internalized from those within the faith. What did you discover about the religion and throughout your research?
What was so wonderful for me to discover, and I guess something that I really wanted, particularly for people outside the Muslim community, but also within the Muslim community to be aware of or to remember, is that this is not a new thing. Women fighting for their rights and using Islam as the tool to achieve their rights has existed from the earliest days of Islam. Women would go to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and say, you know, my husband's doing this, I'm not allowed to do this, you know, agitating for their rights, saying, please tell them what I'm due, what's allowed for me in my religion. So from the earliest days, women would stand up for themselves and frame it within, Allah has given me this right. You know, you don't let people take it away from me. So this is nothing new. Women have always been doing this work. And unfortunately, you know, as Muslims, we don't always get it right. We're people, and we're going to fail, and we're not going to live up to the ideals of our faith. But there have always been these people, these women and men, who have always been making sure they stand up for this justice, the way that their religion requires. So
do you approach it from sexism as a separate issue to research and observe, and Islamophobia as a separate, or is there an intersection between the two?
Yeah, they actually, what was a surprise to me was just how enmeshed these two things are. So when I would speak to the women about fighting sexism within the Muslim community, for example, what they would say to me again and again was that it was actually also the negative attitudes of non-Muslims that would make their work harder. So to give you an example of what I mean, they would sort of feel wedged between these two issues. So they'd say, if we want to speak openly about sexism that's happening within the Muslim community, domestic violence, for example, if we want to organise an event and speak openly, we know that if we do that, that can reinforce stereotypical views that people have about Muslims, that Muslim men are violent, that we're oppressed. If we don't speak about it, then we don't get to address it. But if we do also speak about it, not only could we be reinforcing these negative ideas, but people within our own community might get angry at us. Why are you airing our dirty laundry? You shouldn't be talking about this. So they can sort of feel quite trapped about, well, what do we do? How do we address this issue without making things worse in either of these places?
I want to kind of hone in on Islamophobia, and maybe you can contextualize this for us, especially for a Malaysian audience. In a Muslim majority country, maybe we're not exposed to as, you know, it's not as prevalent. There's not as much overt Islamophobic messaging out there. But what does that look like? What does Islamophobia look like in the context of daily life? Maybe even for someone in Australia.
It's a really interesting two dichotomous stories. On the one hand, it's actually very easy to be Muslim in Australia. It's very easy for me to be a visibly Muslim woman. You know, I go out in my hijab, I work, you know, people aren't abusing me on the street every day. It's a very easy life. A lot of businesses and government are sort of set up to support it. There's halal food everywhere. So in many ways, it's quite easy. But on the other hand, Islamophobia is a grim reality. Since the attacks on October 7 in Israel, Islamophobia has increased 1,300% in Australia, which is a staggering increase. Anti-Semitism has increased as well. So things can be quite tense, particularly when events happen overseas or there are controversial political events. And I guess in the context of Malaysia, of course, like you said, in some ways you're quite protected of it here. But I guess as we become a more and more globalised society, we're all exposed to the same social media and mainstream media outlets. unfortunate ideas can seep in. And so this is something that all of us need to be quite aware of and be very conscious of not, everything's so polarized.
Yeah.
Society can seem very siloed where we get our information from, and it's something, you're in a privileged position here in Malaysia, and it's something to protect really strongly and not have unfortunate external influences changing the way people view each other.
So I've been thinking a lot about that, and I'm curious to know, as a sociologist of religion, what would you say are the reasons for Islamophobia? What are the roots of Islamophobia?
Well, unfortunately, they're very old.
Okay.
I suppose if you look at the earliest days of Islam, there was opposition to Islam as a faith. So was that Islamophobia when the other Quraysh were angry? Like, was that Islamophobia? But even if we look at it just as a historical context in the West, it has, and this is going to get a bit theoretical, but it has a very interesting history in the West, in that what is very interesting is when you look at attitudes that West, the Europe in particular, had towards Muslim women, it was always what it saw as the opposite of itself. So in the early days, hundreds of years ago, when Europe and Britain liked to see itself as very sort of puritanical, they'd even put skirts on their pianos because we don't want to see their feet. Muslim women and the harem were seen as like the opposite of that, unbridled, inappropriate behavior. It was just a hotbed of, lasciviousness. That was what Muslim women were. The veil was a sign of her, being a temptress. Now that the West likes to see itself as much more liberated, women are individuals, they have freedom, they can dress how they want. Muslim women are again the opposite of that. Now they're oppressed, now they're repressed, now they're covered, and that's a bad thing. So it's interesting that however the West viewed itself, the Muslim woman was the opposite, the other, was always the other and a negative other.
That's fascinating. So, and that's kind of cascaded throughout history. Right. How do you address that? And I understand that you have been part of countering Islamophobia councils, and you worked on strategies in the US and the UK as well. What are the ways to counter Islamophobia? What strategies, what initiatives? Can it be done top down, or does it need to be organically from grassroots level?
What was interesting for me about my research, and one thing I guess at first was a bit frustrating, because I honestly went doing this research thinking, well, there's going to be one sort of silver bullet. There's one thing we have to do.
Always want
Once
a silver
we do
bullet,
that, everything will be great. No more prejudice. Everything will be wonderful. You'll be shocked to hear that was not the outcome. And what I realized from doing my research is actually what we need is a lot of different approaches, because people's fears and prejudices come from different places. So for some people, they just need to meet a Muslim and talk to them. So in Australia, only 3.2% of the population is Muslim, which means that most Australians will never have a Muslim friend, colleague or neighbour. Which means that the only source of information they're getting about Islam is the media, which, isn't always the most nuanced account. So for some of those people, just meeting a Muslim and going, oh, you're a person like me, and let me ask you my questions, that can be enough. For other people, they do need to maybe learn more, what they hear about the rules of Islam or the laws of Islam is what scares them. And having a proper education about Islam can be the kind of thing that reassures them. There is no silver bullet. There's a lot of different approaches that are needed. They are all needed, and this is something, because these can be quite ingrained attitudes, these are things that are going to take a lot of time. It's not, unfortunately, just a quick, I'll have a coffee with a Muslim woman and that's the end, everything's great, I'm not worried anymore. It can take a lot of repeated exposures or interventions, because it's been a lifetime of getting to this point.
Understood. So where would you say the role of governments are? Let's just take either federal or state level governments. What would be the role of governments in being one of those approaches? What interventions would governments do? And this is based also off your work from in the UK as well, right?
Definitely the work of governments is absolutely crucial. We know, for example, just the way government politicians will speak about minority groups has a massive impact. There was a really shocking statistic about a time when Boris Johnson said something quite pejorative about Muslim women, and suddenly there was this spike of Islamophobic attacks on the street. There is a real connection between what politicians say and what attitudes they validate, and then how the community feels they can act. which is scary, but it also shows how powerful it can be if politicians front foot and say, we are a country where everyone is welcome, and these are the contributions that Muslims and all these other minority groups have made to this country. You belong here, you are part of us, you are an amazing contribution. That also changes things. So we know that it's the messaging, but also it's about, it comes down to the grim reality of dollars, financially investing in these communities as well, good leadership, the programs that they need. That makes a big difference too.
It just feels to me that we have more of one kind of politician than the others. It's not a balanced landscape at the moment. You get more of that kind of Islamophobic rhetoric or even prejudice rhetoric coming up from politicians in the past years. Does that concern you, Susan?
It can, I think, but what's reassuring to me is that generally the really awful ones are the lone voice, and most politicians will come out and say, sorry, that is not what we think, this is not what we agree with. And I guess that's also part of being a flourishing democracy, is people get to say things that we don't always agree with. What's reassuring for me as a Muslim woman is that even when politicians or just the person on the street say something unpleasant, there's generally always far more people that say, we're not putting up with that. That's not how we talk here. That's not what we think.
So it's our responsibility as well to make our voices heard when we want to say, no, that's not reflective of how I see or how I think.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And also, from the perspective of Islamophobia and as Muslims, because that matters so much to us and we want non-Muslims to stand up for us, we also need to make sure that we're doing that for other people as well. This can't just be something that just we're the receivers of, that people support us. We need to, in terms of social cohesion and everyone belonging and not having, community hatred, who are the people that I need to be standing up for? Who are the people that I need to speak up for as well? That's a responsibility all of us have to protect everybody. That's the only way we can have a flourishing society.
So I wanted to look back in the past 6 months or so, ever since the latest war on Gaza escalated, and how that has contributed, as you pointed out, to the rise of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. What do we do then in a society that is increasingly polarized over what's happening in the Middle East? How do we live together and not deepen the divide?
It is incredibly difficult. It's such a sensitive topic, and so many people in Australia, I imagine it's the same here in Malaysia, feel so passionately, understandably about it. And it is something that we need to really be very conscious of, not letting this destroy our society. That of course it's important that we have our perspectives and our viewpoints and we share them, but it cannot become a toxic element in our society. It can't become something that is destructive. And wherever it is possible, we need to be willing to reach across the divide and find people that we can work with and collaborate with, because the more divided we are, the worse things get. No one benefits from that outcome.
Well, I'm also concerned about the narrative, the messaging out there, because as you pointed out, most people get their information or form their worldviews based on what they're seeing in the media or what they're reading on social media. Talk to me about how you, through your research, you've seen the media perpetuate some of these stereotypes, some of these biases about Muslim communities. Yeah,
unfortunately, I did do a piece of analysis in the wake of the most recent war on Gaza and the language that media in Australia can use. And it's really interesting just to see the way certain communities are humanised and dehumanised. The descriptive words that we will use for the damage inflicted on one community and not the other. These things matter, because when so many people, all the information they're getting about these wars and the people involved in these wars is only through the media, the way we talk about the people who are the victims of this war really matters, because it becomes very dehumanizing. And it's not just how we're dehumanizing people who are victims in a war, but it also then impacts how we see each other in society. And so the media really has to take a real responsibility for that. But as consumers, we also need to be very conscious of the type of media that we are consuming, and consuming uncritically. Always when we get a source, go, hang on, well, where did that information come from? Is this a verified source, or is this just some auntie sending it to me on WhatsApp? You know, like, we need to make sure this is legitimate, and always have a skeptical and critical mind about what we consume, and always be willing to be open to, I could be wrong about this. I need to make sure and seek enough information, and not only to ever only get our information from people who think like us. It's very easy to only go to the news sources that agree with us and have the political bent we do. That's how we get a very narrow and skewed view of the world.
How does social media fit into this then? Is that a force for truly democratizing the narratives around what's happening, or is it more echo chambers and channels for disinformation?
I think it's both. I think, again, if we look at the war in Gaza, it's been a very crucial tool in getting at the reality of what's happened and some very awful stories.
Yeah, so they say this is a genocide being live streamed from into people's phones.
Right, which, just as an aside, we need to think about the spiritual impact that has on all of us. Yeah. Watching this, it takes a great toll on us as people, and I don't think we should minimize the impact. And that doesn't mean we become indifferent or we don't care, but it's something to be conscious of.
How has it impacted you these past 6 months?
I think, like all of us, it's been devastating. Devastating to see these unrelenting images of horror happening to innocent people is beyond belief. And I think anyone with a heart is devastated by those images and frustrated by what we see as the lack of action on this. And so I think on the one hand, it's good because, like you said, it democratizes information that otherwise people would not know about is getting out. But on the other hand, it also the algorithms in particular will silo us. And if we don't force ourselves to, like, one thing I do is I force myself to follow news sites and accounts of people I really dislike and really disagree with.
Wow.
And this is not hate following. That's a very different thing. This is me watching and going, I need to understand how a different side sees this. I have to understand this. Otherwise, we just become very self-referential. I'm always right. And then it's very easy to just dismiss the other side as evil or stupid. And that's on any debate. That's not just about Gaza, that's about everything. We need to follow people and news outlets that are very different to us, because we have to force ourselves not to just get into that echo chamber.
So that's your message to people, to make sure that they are thinking about a whole range of diverse voices, but also thinking about the other side and understanding where people come from. That essentially is the heart of your work in combating Islamophobia, isn't it?
It is, and in terms of understanding the other side, that doesn't mean we agree.
Okay.
It's okay to come and go, I need, the ideal situation in any of these disagreements should be that I can make the best faith argument about that person's case to show that I really understand it. If I told you your argument back to you, would you agree with it? And so that shows that I really understand it. Now, I may still disagree and say, I know this is what you think, I think you're wrong, but at least I know that I think you're wrong because I actually understand your opinion and your viewpoint, as opposed to just arguing with a straw man or stereotypes. None of us like it when people do it about us. I don't like it when people do it about me as a Muslim woman or anything else. So I have to, before I can make that opinion about anyone else's opinion or even make up my own mind, truly understand the other side. I may still come away, like I said, disagreeing, but at least I know why you say what you do.
Can I ask you, has your approach changed from when you first started and now? Because it's so easy to kind of fall into this jaded narrative, and because you meet all kinds of people with different perspectives. Has your approach changed? Do you find that it's evolved in any way?
I hope that it has. I hope that the attitudes that I have now are different to what I had 25 years ago, because if they're not, it shows that I haven't grown and I haven't learned anything. The idea that I maybe knew everything at 19 that I'd need to know for the rest of my life is, I think, quite naive and probably arrogant of me. So I hope that my ideas have evolved, and I hope they will continue to, as I hope that I'm always in a position to say, when new correct information comes to me, I am prepared to change my mind.
Okay, all right. In the few minutes that we have left, I do want to ask you, given that you are a voice within the Muslim community in Australia and within the field, what do you think is the most pressing challenge? What do we need to address for Muslim women today, even if people watching who are not Muslim women? What do you think is necessary in the current landscape terms of priorities to advance the rights of women?
I think the number one thing is to listen to Muslim women. So, for example, I would never assume to tell Malaysian Muslim women what they need. They know what they need, and that will probably be different to what Australian Muslim women need and what Turkish Muslim women need. We need to speak to them and say, tell us what the priorities are for you and how can we help?
Right. And what is Eid going to look like for you?
A lot of food. I think a lot of food and a lot of daytime coffee is what I'm looking forward to, and family, of course.
Okay, well, thank you so much for being
Thank
on
you
the
for
show.
having me.
It's been such a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. It's my honour. Thank you so much.
Happy Eid to you.
Happy Hari Raya.
Thank you. That's all we have for you on this episode of The Future is Female. I'm Melisa Idris signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. And good night.